Welcome to another edition of Mrs. Piggle Wiggle Chapter Readings. I'm Miss Barbara from the Huntington Beach Library. You can see I've got on our summer reading program t-shirt, which is Dig Deeper, Read, Investigate, Discover. So you can join our reading program at hbpl.beanstack.com. Get credit. Give yourself points for listening to me read these stories. And we have weekly raffles with our reading program, a grand prize raffle drawing, plus everyone who completes the program will be getting a goodie bag. Now a little bit background for Mrs. Piggle Wiggle. She's a cross between Nanny McPhee and Mary Poppins. She lives in an upside down house, and she is the one that everyone goes to when they need a cure for some common childhood elements such as won't put away your toys. I'm not sure none of you would do that. Won't take a bath, refuse to go to bed, and today's cure is for the slow eater, tiny bite taker. And there you can see. We're going to find out what the cure is for the slow eater, tiny bite taker cure. This is from the Mrs. Piggle Wiggle Treasury by Betty MacDonald, illustrated by Hilary Knight. Miss Piggle Wiggle books are available for checkout in our library. We also have one available as an ebook that you can download on a computer or tablet. So, the slow eater, tiny bite taker cure. Once upon a time, there was a little boy named Alan. He had curly brown hair and sturdy legs and a big shiny smile. One morning he sat down to breakfast, but instead of picking up a spoon and eating his mush and milk like a good little boy, he took out a fork and began eating his cereal, grain by grain. When his mother, certain he had eaten all of his oatmeal, brought him his egg, he was still on his 11th piece of cereal. Alan's mother said, "My goodness, Alan, you are poky this morning. What's the matter? Is your mush too hot?" And then she noticed that Alan was eating his oatmeal with a fork, so she took the fork away and handed him a spoon and said, "Now, dear, I want you to eat properly and hurry up, your egg is going to get cold." Alan took the spoon, but instead of filling it with mush, he daintily lifted one grain from the bowl and slowly brought the grain up to his mouth. His mother watched him for a few minutes and said, "Well then, go ahead and eat an ice-cold egg if you'd like, but I am going upstairs to sort laundry, and when I come down, I want to find every bit of that oatmeal and all that egg eaten." Alan's mother went skipping upstairs and left Alan in the breakfast nook. As soon as his mother left the kitchen, Alan picked up the fork again and began eating. He ate his mush grain by grain. In a little while, even a whole grain seemed to be too much, so he broke the grain into twos, taking only half grains, one fork at a time. He was so interested in his teeny, tiny, itty-bitty bites that he didn't hear his mother come in, and was very surprised when she suddenly whisked away his breakfast and sent him marching upstairs to his room. At lunchtime, Alan's mother made cream of tomato soup. It was Alan's very favorite soup. But Alan, instead of eating it quickly and asking for more, began to break up his crackers into his soup, and so they were just little itty-bitty tiny crumbs. And then he floated and chased and ate the crumbs one by one. At 2:00, his mother stopped the little cracker crumb chase, sadly cleared the table, and sent Alan upstairs for a nap. At dinner that night, Alan cut his meat into such small pieces that his father looked over at him and said, "Perhaps you'd like to borrow my magnifying glass. I'm sure you're going to need it to see those little teeny tiny bits of meat you've cut." Alan's mother said, "He's been like this all day long, eating his mush grain by grain with a fork, floating little tiny cracker crumbs in his soup, and chasing and eating them one by one. And now the meat. What is wrong with you, Alan?" And Alan just smiled his shiny smile and said, "Well, I guess I'm just a slow eater. I'll choke if I take any bigger bites." And his mother said, "Nonsense, you were fine yesterday." And Alan said very sadly, "That was yesterday. This is today. And today I have to take teeny tiny bites or I'll choke. I will." And then he put a little itty bitty microscopic bit of meat on the tip of his tongue. The next morning, Alan had not improved at all. And though his mother scolded and begged, he took the smallest, slowest bites imaginable. And to make matters worse, he sighed and gazed around the room after every single bite. It was taking forever. Alan's mother was very distressed, and not knowing what else to do, she called her friend Mrs. Crankmeyer. "Good morning, Mrs. Crankmeyer," said Alan's mother. "This is Alan's mother, and I called to ask if you ever had any difficulty at all getting Winterfield to eat." And Mrs. Crankmeyer said, "Difficulty? What do you mean by difficulty, my dear?" "Well," said Alan's mother, "Alan is taken to eating so slowly that if I didn't take his plate away, I'm sure it would take him approximately 12 hours to eat an average meal. He eats his cereal grain by grain, his soup drop by drop, and his meat pour by pour." "Goodness gracious, is the child ill?" asked Mrs. Crankmeyer. "No, he says he feels perfectly well, and I've taken his temperature, and it's normal. I don't know what the trouble is," said Alan's poor, worried mother. Mrs. Crankmeyer said, "Well, I certainly have no complaint about Wilfred's eating. My only difficulty is getting him to stop. Why, yesterday morning before breakfast he weighed 182 pounds, and his father's beginning to call him Blimpy." "Oh, my goodness," said Alan's mother. "I guess you have a more serious problem than I have," and she hung up the phone. So then she called her friend, Mrs. Wingsprog. "Hello, Mrs. Wingsprog," she said. "Do you have any trouble with Peggy at meal times?" And Mrs. Wingsprog said, enunciating very carefully, "Well, not exactly trouble, but we do have to keep her up, chewing every mouthful 100 bites at a time. Sometimes she chews not enough times. One time I was timing her, and she only chewed 98 times, and why, just yesterday it was only 75 times." Now, Alan's mother, listening to this, could already picture how disastrous it would be if Alan heard about Peggy Wingsprogger's chewing each bite 100 times, because if she multiplied each grain of mush in the dish by 100 and took into account the unbelievable slowness in which Alan was able to chew, she realized he would die of slow starvation before the day had passed. Alan's mother hurriedly said goodbye and hung up the phone. She then called Patsy's mother, and she said, "Hello, this is Alan's mother. Does Patsy eat everything that is put before her quickly and without urging?" And Patsy's mother said, "Why, yes, she does." And Alan's mother said, "Well, I'm asking because Alan is taken to eating like a scared mosquito. I don't know what to do." And Patsy's mother said, "Well, you know who you should call." And we know it's not Ghostbusters. Who should she call? "You should call Mrs. Piggle Wiggle. She'll know exactly what to do. You remember the radish cure, don't you?" And Alan's mother was delighted. "Oh, yes, the radish cure for the little girl who would not take a bath. Yes, that's exactly what I'll do. I'll call Mrs. Piggle Wiggle right now." And that's exactly what she did. Mrs. Piggle Wiggle said, "Oh, so Alan has become a slow eater, tiny biter taker, has he? I thought he looked a little pale this morning." And Alan's mother said, "He is so pale that his father calls him his little doughboy, and I know he hasn't eaten more than a tablespoon of food in the last 2 days. Whatever will I do, Mrs. Piggle Wiggle?" And Mrs. Piggle Wiggle said, "Oh, don't worry. Don't worry about Alan. He'll be all right in a day or two. Let me see. Oh, yes, here it is. Alan's coming down the street right now, so I can send him home with the slow eater, tiny bite taker dishes. I'll send those dishes home with him when he leaves tonight. Use the largest set for Alan's dinner tonight, the medium size for his meals tomorrow, the small size the next day, and the very, very tiny dishes for the last day. That will be 4 days in all, counting today, and though he may lose some weight, he'll gain it all right back. I may send for him on the last day, and no matter how he feels, let him come to my house." Alan's mother said. "Oh, thank you so much, Mrs. Piggle Wiggle. I'll do exactly what you say, and I'll be so happy when he is cured."
"I'll send Alan home right away with the dishes," said Mrs. Piggle Wiggle. "Now don't you worry. Simply follow my instructions."
And Mrs. Piggle Wiggle said goodbye. After a little while, Alan came home carrying a large wicker basket.
"Here's a present from Mrs. Piggle Wiggle, Mother. She said it was for me and to be very careful with it."
He set the wicker basket on the kitchen floor and started to undo the fastenings. His mother said, "Oh, no, dear. That's a present from me, and I think I'll put it aside for now. Now you run along and play until dinner." "Goodness, you are pale. Run as fast as you can down to Patsy's house and put some roses in your cheeks." Alan's mother put the basket on the top shelf in the kitchen and shut the cupboard door, which left nothing for Alan to do but to go out and play. However, instead of running down to Patsy's house, he walked very, very slowly because he was very tired from not having enough to eat. Just before dinner, Alan's mother took down the basket and opened it. There were 4 sets of little dishes. The largest set had the plate the size of a saucer, a cup the size of a small after-dinner coffee cup, a small fork, and a spoon. The medium set had a plate the size of a doll plate, a doll cup, and a very small fork and spoon. The small set had the plate the size of a silver dollar. And for those of you who might not know how big a silver dollar is, it's slightly bigger than a quarter. It's about like that size. That's a pretty small plate. It had a cup the size of a thimble, a fork like a match, and a spoon like a salt spoon. And for those of you who are not sure what salt spoons are, they're maybe about 3 inches long. And you use them in the old days. They would use them to put salt with fancy salt and pepper shakers. All right, and the very, very tiny set had the plate the size of a penny, a cup the size would hold but a drop, a fork like a needle, and a spoon like a pin. That's like really tiny. Alan's dinner that night was served on the large set. He was given a baked potato as small as an egg, a piece of meat the size of a postage stamp, that's pretty small, a slice of tomato, and a small cup of milk. Alan was so interested in taking tiny bites that he didn't even notice the new dishes. He ate 1/3 of the potato, 1/6 of the meat, 1 tomato seed, and drank about half cup of milk. That is not very much. When he asked to be excused, his father looked at that small cup and saucer, still a heap of food, and started to say, but his mother interrupted and said, "All right, dear, if that's what you want, you may be excused, but you must go to your room until bedtime." The next morning, his mother put a teaspoon of scrambled eggs and an inch square of toast on the medium-sized plate, a tablespoon of orange juice in the doll cup. Alan loved the tiny fork and spoon because he was able to take such small bites that in 1 hour he had eaten but half of the egg and 1/3 of the toast. He did drink all of the orange juice. At lunch and dinner, he ate even less and took even smaller bites. He had turned a very pale green and was so tired he had to lay down all the time, which is what happens when you don't eat enough food. You get tired and weak. The next day, his mother brought out the small dishes. Remember, that's the silver dollar-sized plate. On the dollar plate, she put 3 cornflakes, a piece of bacon the size of a snowflake, a 1/4 teaspoon of egg, and in the thimble cup, she put 10 drops of cocoa. Alan was so tired, he had to crawl to the breakfast table on his hands. He was happy about the tiny dishes, however, and gave his mother a very sickly edition of the shiny smile. He cut the cornflakes into 13 pieces and ate 1 part of one. He ate the speck of egg, nibbled a bacon, and 5 drops of the cocoa, and had to crawl away and lay down on the couch. Now here he is. Look how tiny the teeny tiny dishes are. And there's poor Alan, who's gotten so tired and weak from not eating he has to crawl. For lunch, he had 7 drops of soup, 2 cracker crumbs, and enough milk to barely moisten his lips. For dinner, he ate 1 lima bean and drank 4 drops of milk. He crawled up to bed right after dinner. He had to rest 8 times crawling up the stairs, which is what happens when you don't eat enough. You get very tired and very weak. The next morning he was so tired it took him almost a half an hour to crawl down the stairs to breakfast. His mother had put out the penny plate, 1 drop cup, and a needle fork and pin spoon. On the penny plate she had 1 grain of egg, 2 toast crumbs, and 2 raspberry jam seeds. She had a drop of milk in the cup. Alan was so weak he had to lift the fork needle with 2 hands, but even so he cut 1 of the grains of egg into 2 and ate only 1 of the toast crumbs. He drank half the drop of milk and then lay down right on the breakfast nook because he's so tired he can hardly stand up anymore. Just then the telephone rang, and guess who it was? If you guessed Mrs. Piggle Wiggle, you're right. It was Mrs. Piggle Wiggle. His mother had to carry him to the telephone and hold the big, heavy phone receiver. Mrs. Piggle Wiggle had great difficulty in hearing his weak, squishy voice and finally had to give up and talk to his mother. Mrs. Piggle Wiggle said,
"All right, it's Alan's turn to exercise the spotted pony, and I would like him to come over here right now. I know how excited he is when he gets to exercise the pony."
Alan's mother told him, and yes, he was very excited, but he was so weak that his mother had to carry him out and put him in his little red wagon. Fortunately, it was all the way downhill to Mrs. Piggle Wiggle's house, and when he got there, there was Dick Thompson and Hubbard Prentice waiting for him out in front. They lifted him out of his little red wagon and laid him across Spotty's back. Spotty's the pony. Spotty turned his head and licked the top of Alan's head. Mrs. Piggle Wiggle came out to her front porch to see him off, and it took much self-control for her to keep from laughing as Spotty started slowly down the street with Alan laying on his back like a big bag of cornmeal. All morning Alan lay on Spotty's back, his face buried in his mane, while Spotty paced the streets. Several times women rushed out of their houses to ask Alan if he was ill, if he needed any help, and Alan was very embarrassed and squealed out,
"No, I'm all right."
But he was too weak to sit up. When 12 o'clock came, Alan was so tired that he knew he could not stay on Spotty's back any longer, so he guided the pony up to his own front gate. Then he rolled off his back onto the grass, and he lay there like a wet sock bawling. Because here it was his turn to have fun with the pony, and he's so weak because he hasn't eaten anything that he couldn't enjoy himself, and he didn't really get to exercise the pony at all. His mother looked out the kitchen window, and seeing him lying there, she became frightened. She thought Spotty was a spirited horse and that maybe he'd bucked Alan off. She ran out and knelt beside him. "Darling," she said, "are you hurt? Did that vicious horse throw you? How many times did he buck?" And Alan smiled weakly at the idea of very gentle little Spotty bucking or throwing anybody. But then he began to cry again because he remembered that this was his last chance for the time to exercise Spotty, and he was so weak that he couldn't stand his back, and he couldn't ride him when it was his turn, and now he's going to have to wait all over again, and it's going to be such a long time. And he finally said to his mother, "Spotty didn't throw me. It's just that I'm so tired. I can't stand his back, and I rolled off, and now I can't get back on, and it's my turn to exercise, and I won't have another chance for a really long time because everyone else has to wait in line too for their turn. I ruined mine." Poor Alan. Alan's mother said, "Now see here, Alan. This all comes you turning into a slow eater, tiny bite taker. And if you want to ride Spotty this afternoon, you will have to come to the house and eat something to gain your strength." She tied Spotty to the fence, picked Alan up, carried him into the house, and set him in the breakfast nook. He leaned weakly back against the wall and closed his eyes. His mother began rattling pots and turning on burners, and pretty soon she handed him a drop cup filled with cream and tomato soup and a penny plate with 2 cracker crumbs on it. And she said, "Now drink this soup in one gulp and put both crumbs in your mouth at once." Alan did as he was told, leaned back and closed his eyes again. Then his mother handed him the thimble cup filled with milk and a tiny peanut butter sandwich on the dollar plate. She said, "Now drink this milk in one swallow and put that whole sandwich in your mouth." Alan did and was surprised to find he didn't feel quite so tired. He leaned back, but this time he kept his eyes open. Then his mother handed him the doll cup filled with soup and the doll plate with some cottage cheese on it. "Now drink that soup right up," she said, "and here is a large fork, and I want that cottage cheese eaten in 2 bites. And Alan did exactly what he was told. My, but he was feeling strong. He could sit up without leaning back, and oddly, he actually felt hungry. His mother handed him the after-dinner coffee cup filled with milk and a saucer plate with a piece of gingerbread cookie on it. Alan didn't even have to be told to eat or drink this. He took large, hungry bites and big, swishy gulps, and the dishes were empty. And his mother said, "Well, how do you feel? Do you feel better, dear? Have you had enough lunch?" And Alan said,
"You know, I do feel better, Mother, but I'm still very hungry. May I please have a large bowl of soup and a large glass of milk?"
And his mother said, "Why, of course, dear." And she quickly filled the large bowl with soup and the large glass with milk. Alan ate every drop of soup and drank every drop of milk, and then jumped up and said,
"Oh, Mom, I bet Spotty's hungry. Can I take him some soup?"
Now, who gives soup to a horse? And his mother said, "No, dear. I think Spotty would much prefer an apple and maybe some lumps of sugar." So they fed Spotty, and then Alan climbed back on Spotty's back and rode proudly away, sitting up very straight and holding on to the reins with one hand. When he reached the corner by Patsy's house, his mother called to him to come back. He turned Spotty around and steered him up to the gate, and his mother came out with the basket of the slow eater, tiny bite-taker dishes. "Would you please take these back to—" Who's he going to take them back to? "Mrs. Piggle Wiggle?" she asked.
"Not at all," said Alan graciously. "Just hand me the basket. I'll put it here in front of me and hold on to it with this hand. You see, Mother, I can just use one hand to steer now." And he very carefully arranged the basket, kissed his mother, clucked to Spotty, and away they went in a very slow walk all the way back to Mrs. Piggle Wiggle's house. Another successful cure for Mrs. Piggle Wiggle. This is from the Mrs. Piggle Wiggle Treasury. Join me next Saturday at 3, and we'll be posting another video from the Mrs. Piggle Wiggle Treasury with a brand new cure. This is Miss Barbara signing off. Stay happy, stay healthy, stay safe, and don't forget to dig deeper, read, investigate, discover.